In our discussion this morning, we had a large perspective of the development of Indian spirituality, its original integrality, specialized paths, systems, philosophies, and diversity that it gave birth to, and the rich cultural forms that it developed to the extremes. And then the entire movement of unifying, mixing, churning, of which the most critical aspect we dwelt upon is the integral yoga itself, which is the necessary foundation for the future human development. And all of this was primarily centered on India. The theme now is opening the perspective to the rest of the world, India's relation to the world and its role. And within this, we will see the kind of training and education and cultural priorities necessary in the present. When you look back at the civilization, any civilization, you cannot judge it by its present condition. The fact is, all cultures, all civilizations are in a state of decline today. Some more, some less, and sometimes in different ways. Even India cannot be judged by what she is or was 50 years ago. She can be judged, though, by what she was 200 years ago, or even more by 500 years ago, and even more by 2000 years ago. And interestingly, unlike a European culture, where the farther back you go, the darker it gets, in India, the farther back you go, the brighter it gets. And there's a reason for that. We see the big picture of the declining phase of larger cycles of yogas, of which the peak, as we record, is of the last golden age, Satya Yuga, and the phase of 3 steps of decline, 4 steps of decline. And it's perhaps worth dwelling on this briefly. Sri Aurobindo explains the logic and the psychology behind these 4 steps. Why are there 4 steps? So I'll give it through an analogy. When you do your, let's say, New Year resolution, and all of us might have done something on the New Year day, and you decide, let's say, I am going to get up early and do exercise, or I will not eat sugar, not chocolate, whatever you've decided. The first time when you are choosing to do it, it's a free choice, full of enthusiasm, full of intensity, and the truth of what you feel and the action which emerges is really one. The truth flows into action spontaneously. That's your Satya Yuga. You do not have to make an effort. But after a few days, as you wake up from sleep early in the morning, you struggle a little bit, a gap begins to form. And you discover that although the enthusiasm is within you, it's difficult to translate. Your body is unable to keep up, and there's a gap which is forming between the two. And what do you do to compensate for the gap? You will your body. You force it. And this second phase, where the truth is no more spontaneous but driven by personal will, you know what is right, but you have to make an effort to make it happen. That's your next yuga, where the spontaneity of the truth is fading in the because of the gap, and now society tries to live by the ideals by force of will. And this is your Treta Yuga. The third stage happens when your will begins to break down because the gap is too great. I'm really forcing my body, but my body pulls me back. At that point, what do? You call up your friend. When you wake up, please come throw water on my face, pull me out of bed. Or I set an alarm clock, and I set the alarm clock in the next room so that it keeps on beeping until I get up and go and switch it off. So you're creating external devices to compel the truth upon you. A society organizes external structures to freeze, to fix, to preserve, catch, hold, bind the truth somehow in forms. And in the very act, of course, the truth gets warped. The moment you're forcing it on someone within you begins also a rebellion. oh, this alarm clock, oh, this insistence, oh, these rules, these laws, they begin to suffocate you. But that's your third phase. In fact, it's in this third phase of the Dwapara that you have the creation of religions and social systems and structures, and you will see all the texts of codification. So and so Shastra says this is the right thing to do, right way to do, and so on. In the first stage of the Satya Yuga, you didn't need a Shastra because the truth was spontaneous. Dharma was spontaneously felt and expressed. Second phase, you felt it. So again, you didn't need a text. You felt it, but you had to will, to push, to make an effort. So the necessity in that phase was development of will. In the third phase, because you're not even sure, you don't feel the truth anymore, you need forms to bind and tell you this is the truth. But when the suffocation becomes strong enough, the binding warps the truth to the point where it becomes a falsehood. You see what happens? The moment you're forced to do something and it's so mechanized that I'm an exceptional case, I'm sick and yet you make me get up. It has become falsehood. Or other changes. At that point you have the reaction to break. And that leads to the fourth stage, which is the Kali. It is often described as darkness. Darkness simply because you don't feel the truth anymore, you don't know the truth anymore. What happens at that point? External devices to teach you also are lost. At that point, Sri Aurobindo observes, human nature, human being cannot ignore the truth. There is an attempt to find the truth because you don't find it anywhere. The forms externally taught have become pretentious or false. So you begin to look. And it goes through multiple stages. And it's still called Kali because you don't know the truth, but you're looking for it. That's the point. And so in the Kali is the first questing to satisfy the truth of my body. And my body and its needs are all that matter. I don't know about soul and spirituality. All that is imagination. Once I've satisfied my body's needs, I say, I'm not satisfied. There's something more. And you move to the larger drive of your desire, higher desire, and emotional satisfaction, which yields eventually to an intellectual seeking and quest and satisfaction. And so there's a whole series of build-ups until we come to the present stage where somehow we find the best of our intellectual construction and solution has failed us. This is the modernism which you saw in the last century, which said, with the power of reason and science, I will solve all problems. There will be prosperity for all, peace everywhere, no wars. Remember the promise? How many times it was given to you? Science will solve. It failed. In fact, we created worse weapons of war, we created worse inequities, and so on. Why? Because we realize the reason as a power can be used for good or bad, and who chooses that is not reason, something else behind. That needs to change. And so what we see is a grand collapse of reason into what is today called postmodernism. Sri Aurobindo used different words, but he anticipated this transition. And he says, when reason fails, what do? You look for a deeper solution. Now, all the external solutions have been attempted and failed. Now you go deeper. What's really my seeking? And an introspection begins, a subjective phase of seeking, which today you will find in the very popular New Age teaching. They will say, follow your bliss, follow your heart's desire, everything is relative, nothing matters except what you want, and so on. But the danger, he says, is when you turn in, you can stop short with the ego and desire centers. And there can be many finer grades of it. And say, this is my soul, this is me, I'm following my desire. And you have a greater collision, greater confusion. Unless you continue to go all the way to the deepest, that is you, in closeness to the soul or self, where my truth and your truth do not collide but become complementary, because the self is one. And although expressed differently in each one of us, they align like rays of the sun. They are all parallel seeming. No ray ever collides with another because they originate from the same oneness. And yet each is distinct and free to flow in its way. Isn't it? That's when the bulk of us, let's say, begin to live more and more by this spontaneous, innate truth of what we are, dawns the next Satya Yuga. So the end of the Kali is marked by a transition in what Sri Aurobindo calls the subjective age. And there's a false subjectivism and a true subjectivism of the self, which yields to the true golden age, But if you stop with the false subjectivism, you have one of the greatest dangers of collapse or destruction of civilization. And we are today in this churning between these two. The world is in a churning between these two. And the only thing which can save is a deliberate turn towards the spirituality, the deeper understanding of what is happening within us, and the means and tools by which we can go deeper to the true self. And that's why India's role is so important in the world, because this is the only civilization in which this has been so deeply established that if there is one place on earth where this deeper truth can be rediscovered, it is here. I'm not saying the India of today is a good example. What I'm saying is, if it has to manifest, it is here that it can manifest most easily. And if it cannot, if we fail, well, it will find others, maybe less effective, maybe smaller in numbers, but the truth will fulfill itself. But through much suffering, through much conflict. And that is why Sri Aurobindo's insistence on India recovering her soul. Now you understand the importance of this transition. We are in fact at a stage, again to briefly summarize, Sri Aurobindo describes how the world is coming together. It started with building small units, from individuals to families to tribes to smaller societies, etc., communities. And it has recently, relatively recently, built up the national sense, national identity in a political structure. We have always been culturally a nation, spiritually a nation, the whole of the Indian continent. I don't use the word subcontinent, it's a continent. It is so distinctly separated from the rest of the landmass. But we have always been spiritually, culturally one nation, but its political form of a united and in mentality a sense of identity that spans across in the way it is currently being organized is somewhat new as other nations. But from nationality, there is to be one more step, which is the internationality of humanity. And that transition is again fraught with the same danger. On what basis? And the attempt today, through many of the United Nations, World Bank, and other institutions, is to create a flattening of a monotone. Uniformity, not diversity. Whereas the nature of the self and the evolution so far was self attempting the maximum richness of diversity. But to create monotone in the name of unity or in the name of removing conflict is going against evolution. And if this succeeds, as it seems to be almost succeeding through a lot of these WTO and other structures, a flattening out of the whole world, where China becomes world's manufacturer, India becomes world's IT backend, US becomes world's consumer, Thailand becomes world's whatever. The whole of the world is cut up into pieces, all the cultures and civilizations suppressed and uniformalized to make interdependent in a way that is destroying nature's purpose. In that case, Sri Aurobindo says, if that happens successfully, there will be a massive revolt of the human spirit. The entire system will be destroyed and the whole cycle will begin all over again. But if the correct nature of integration of humanity can take place on the basis of each nation expressing its genius freely, and all the nations meeting in a complementary, let's say, family gathering, learning from each other, sharing with each other, that would be the diversity that the divine will in nature is working towards. That would be the step towards the beginning of a new phase in evolution in humanity. But that can only happen if that principle of collaboration is awakened, which has to be a basis which is universal enough. So you will see collaboration forms in many ways. We have common economic interests, we collaborate. We come from the same surname. The Patels, for example, in the United States will collaborate with each other to create all the hotels and so on. But they don't last. They have always a group ego which is against another group ego. What is the one thing which can unite all and yet leave each one free?
Language.
The self. Language is again dividing against another language. The self is the only thing. all of us are one self in a unique aspect or expression, freely developing your own line, and yet none of us colliding. The rays of the sun, remember. And so recovery, or at least approach of the truth of the self, is the only basis on which human unity is possible in a sustainable way. Of course, there will be intermediate attempts, that's fine. But the recognition, at least, that we are one family is the beginning of it. Now, why is this necessary again? You will see in the internationalism, you have specialized, ideologies which are colliding with each other. And Sri Aurobindo points to two great ones, the communism and capitalism on two extremes. Communism, he says, attempts to realize the truth of equality. Because it's a truth. The fact is we are all equally one self, fundamentally, essentially, with different variations. But how do you realize that in communism? By imposing uniformity. In the imposition is the loss of freedom. And so if you have equality under loss of freedom, you basically become prisoners of a system, and the human spirit will rebel. On the other extreme is capitalism, which catches the principle of liberty. Each one is free to develop your own enterprise, and the best will come out of it. But in the process, what have you done? Not everybody is equally capable. So the more capable begin to dominate the less capable, you quickly build up a hierarchy, and the bulk of humanity now becomes willing slaves to a system, not really free. What is the reason that you're doing the job that you're doing? Because it pays you enough, not because you love it. You accept to be a slave, you accept to hate a work that you do willingly because it pays you. But meanwhile, secretly you're hoping one day I'll make enough money that I'll be able to do what I like to do, which doesn't pay me much or nothing at all, perhaps. Right? So in the mechanism of the system, you find enslavement which is inherent, and this very quickly grows into an international scale. Countries are subjugated to other countries by a system of debts. And the whole international structure is built up to put all other countries under debt of a few, what we call first world rich countries. And by playing on the exchange rates, suddenly you can be made poor and the other person can be made rich. That means if you're living in the US, the effort that you put in 1 hour is considered 100 times more valuable than the same effort that you put of 1 hour in another country because of the exchange rate. If you removed exchange rates, everybody had the same worth in terms of same quality of work for 1 hour, US would not be the richest country. In fact, it's one of the jokes, which it's not a joke, it's true, but it's one of the ways I say it. You're worried about India's GDP? Because it's in dollars that you measure GDP. That's why it's low. Tomorrow you change the exchange rate, your GDP will go up 10 times more. No big deal. But even better, let's forget the exchange rate. Inherent GDP, how would you go up? Every neighbor makes a pact with the next door house. Every morning, the food that we cook, we will sell to each other. Very simple. Now, the food you're cooking for your family, you will sell to the other family, and the food they cook for their family will be sold to you. It will be part of your GDP. Your GDP will triple overnight. You see the joke of GDP? As a measure, it is completely artificial, fake, based on completely contrary values. If you go to the US, you pay money to keep your parents in a home, an old people's home. In India, the parents are looked after because the family loves them. It's not part of GDP, right? So if you reduce everything to a monetary transaction, your GDP will shoot up. But if you live as a family, your GDP will be low. What's the point? Do not chase after GDP. But this means we have to start thinking our own economic framework from our own values and not aligned to those institutions which are designed to turn you into slaves. Now, all of this is to say that capitalism as a framework fails because it turns you into willing slaves. It cannot promise you the true sense of equality. And the person who is at the top has no competence. Let me assure you, somebody like Mark Zuckerberg is a thorough idiot. He's not a skilled man at all. If you see any of his interviews, there's no intelligence involved. He just has a band of people who are intelligent in how they manage their resources to be able to poach on other companies, buy them out with a lot of wealth backed by banks which give them enormous loans. How did they buy WhatsApp? They paid what, $6 billion? How do they pay it back? No way they can pay back 16 billion. There's no way they can pay back. They're not making money on it. How does it work? The system, it's backed by banks which give you money by writing on paper. There is no intelligence, there's no competence, there's no skill involved. The people programming for them are all from India. They're being paid heavily, but where does the money come? Borrowed money from the bank. No meaning at all. When Vodafone bought out Bharti Airtel, 40,000 crores, it's a huge, humongous number. They're going to pay back that money? How? By raising the price, by tripling it if at all they need to do, which they cannot. How did they buy it? And the whole game is hidden behind the play of the banks behind the scenes. All this is tell you that the whole thing is fake. Capitalism as an institution is a lot of fakery that goes on behind the scenes, which only is designed to create enslavement. So this also fails to satisfy the human need. Sri Aurobindo points out that equality and liberty cannot coexist unless there is a third factor, which is the principle of fraternity. That community feeling, that family feeling, which is what unites us and allows us to be equal without hierarchy. So when, for example, we live as a family, when somebody cooks the food for the rest of the family, does she ask, how much are you going to give me back? What do you do on your part? You look after the aspect of family that you can, and each one does their best, and the whole together looks after each other. When one cannot do enough, well, the others are always there to make up for it. This was the framework of our village units. In the village, nobody ever went hungry. This is a fact going back 10,000 years, until the European system was imposed on India. Then the village unit began to break down, and you had poverty, and the villages went to the cities. Why? Because the system does not work. Whereas we had a working system built on the family unit. And the whole of current education is designed to divide us, to split us, and to make us fragmented individual workers. Why is this important? Because if we are to move forward, we have to bring back the principle of fraternity. Sri Aurobindo points out that the French Revolution failed to complete its purpose, liberty, equality, fraternity. You see, they had all the three visions. It failed because it did not put fraternity first. Had they started with fraternity, liberty, equality, and worked on fraternity first, the other two would have been easily fulfilled. And that's why here, to build fraternity in our communities is the first most important thing. And if nothing else, fraternity as children of Mother India will be our starting point. Love Mother India. And then together we can work irrespective of any differences. Love the Divine Mother, who is Mother of all humanity, and all of us can come together. But the educational system now I come to, which has designed to divide us and to reduce us to workers for the industry, finds its origin in the European industrial age. And because it's the industrial age, what do? Everything is seen as industry. So education is also industry, school is a factory, students are raw material, and teachers are there too as machines, chop you, cut you, shape you, and form you into the little pieces that you will fit into the bigger machine that is society. So we need to manufacture so many doctors, so many engineers, so many architects, and fit them into society. Do you want some artists? Well, artists are not useful in our machine of society. You know, they're too maverick. They're always dreamers. So put that aside, suppress it. Now you see how this works. The design of the school is made like an assembly line machine. So grade 1, you have a test. Grade 2, test. Grade 3. The classroom structure is like your production house of a factory. First of all, everybody wears a uniform to make you uniform, to suppress your individuality and creativity. You ring the bell, everybody rushes into the class. You ring the bell, they come out. You're being programmed to act on the little buttons that are being pushed upon you. And you're taught in the classroom, this is how you have to live life. You want to find a job. You're told that's your goal. You find a job. Who's going to create the job? Who's the entrepreneur or the creator of the jobs? That's not your lookout. For that, there's an elite school for the elite families. You see? Whereas our starting point in our traditional training of education was each child is, first of all, not a raw material to be beaten into shape. Each one of us is a conscious soul in evolution. Each comes with a unique swabhava and swadharma. To assist in the emergence of your swadharma and your innate genius. And it can be completely different from one to the other. But each one has an innate genius. That is the purpose of your education. That it is to help you develop the three koshas and to unify them around the center of the soul. Integrate. That's why Sri Aurobindo calls it integral education. Integral is not holistic. Holistic is that which includes all. So let's train a little bit of your intellect. Now we'll train a little bit of your emotions. Now we'll train a little bit of your presentation skills. And then what? You go out into life to live by what values? Well, whatever your ego, desire, complex leads you to. Not very useful. But you have to integrate all these faculties that they act from a little one center. And which center? The deepest, truest you. The soul, psychic being. Now that is the broad objective of the approach of integral education. I don't go into the details of it, but I want to highlight how different these two approaches are. When, therefore, a civilization views its education itself in this way, the civilization promotes genius, promotes entrepreneurship, promotes variety and rich diversity. And the result is, as was discussed earlier by Dr. Belu Mehra, that we have a strong civilization. The strength is in the diversity, held in a unity, which is the overall sense of identity. We are children of Mother India. Equality as well as liberty can coexist. Now, what was the result of such an education? And I will give a few examples, not only in the past, but even in more recent times. My teacher's teacher, Kripali Shastriyar, at the age of 12, had already read the Mahabharata in the original 5 times over. Age 12. What did we do at age 12 in our schools? Do you think you were not capable of this? I'm going to put it another way. We were all capable of having read the Mahabharata 5 times over. But we were not allowed to, or we were not given the necessary nourishment to develop our real potential. Why? Because the entire approach to education is so warped to program you, to control you, to shape you by force and violence into something which is warped. The whole of your grain of being is resisting at each step. And they want to keep you dependent. They don't want to develop the individuality. Now, it seems quite so perverse. In fact, it is. We don't realize it. Go to any school today, the teachers are not intending to be perverse. They are just following the system of what was done to them, effectively repeating, because that's what you're told to do. And because at the end of the day, the control is on how you measure the performance, your exam. And what do you need to do for exam? Learn by heart. Become a dull, monotone repeater. If you are creative, it has no value in the exam. Suppress and kill creativity. When I meet parents, sometimes it is so sad. A child is so creative and capable. I can see potential to be a great leader in her own space. And the parents are saying, stop all this. Your board exams are coming. Now drill your mind day and night, mechanically monotone. And the child is rebelling. When at the age of 12 we could have read the Mahabharata 5 times over at least, or if you wanted to read something else, the whole point is you could have done so much more. You could have been composing great poetry. That's the power innate in our intelligence if nurtured the right way. And I'll give this as one example. Sri Aurobindo points out that in England, somebody is very famous because he can repeat the whole Homer's Iliad by heart. He says nothing. In India, our education is so much more rich. People would know much more. In fact, the mark of a true developed intelligence and memory was you didn't need to carry books. All your books were in your head. Sri Aurobindo used to read a crate full of books every week. And the he would go and return the books to the library, and they would wonder, have you even read them? Swami Vivekananda made this demonstration. He was asked similarly, he would read like voraciously. Somebody asked him, what did you read in this book? He said, well, ask me any page number. And when he was told the page number, he said broadly what was in the content. How do you do that? All of us have that potential in memory. And forget intelligence, which only builds on the memory. Can we do that? And I would like to say it is possible even today. It's not too late. It is much easier when you're younger because your brain is still forming to infuse these capacities. But even today it is possible to boost your intelligence. At the very least, and I've done this with young students, children who have major problems of attention span, attention deficit, relatively low IQ or other problems, I give them a series of exercises to do for boosting of the concentration power. And at the end of a year, one child who was always poor in maths but was interested. After doing these exercises in 1 year, the teacher said, oh, now he's teaching others. And this was, of course, he was young at that time, he must have been 12. But with this some basic exercises which are taught in our yoga system, you can boost your IQ as a measure of intelligence by at least 10 points within a year. It's not a big deal. Why aren't we taught this? Because the knowledge is here. Well, setting aside all that, coming to the core of the whole approach of education, what did it lead to in a civilization which is so diverse? And let's look at the evidence from outside India first, because you may say, well, you are biased. So look at Europe of 500 years ago. And you have Shakespeare, who is writing wonderful plays. He's setting new standards. And one of his greatest plays is called The Merchant of Venice. What is Venice? You have to see the historical context. It was the wealthiest city in the whole of Europe. The rulers in Venice, each one of them was rich enough to be an entire king of a kingdom, and Venice is a tiny island. How did that happen? Do you know? Because Venice was the hub of all shipping to Europe. To Europe, I'm saying. From where? From India. Everything from Europe connecting to India had to go through Venice. And that was the root cause of Venice's great wealth. So all the ships were coming well from India. So in his story, in The Merchant of Venice, this man has 3 ships which had gone to India. They're supposed to come back. But, the shipping lanes passing the Cape of Good Hope, tip of South Africa, there are huge storms. They're often lost. He gets a message, all his ships are gone. He has no money. And at the end of the story, he gets news that actually his ships have come and they're safe. So he becomes suddenly wealthy. The people trading with India, East India Company, became so wealthy they were more powerful than the British king. So the king had to take over the company and nationalize it so that he could be the wealthiest. Now, all of this is to show you how important India was to Europe. In fact, if you go back about 2000 years ago, in Rome, there's a major crisis where the Senate is called in an emergency meeting, and they are discussing how the wealth of Rome, which is built by conquering territories, they didn't build the wealth, they stole wealth from their territories, taxing them or usurping them. The wealth of Rome is being frittered away, the coffers are becoming empty because all the Romans are buying Indian textiles and Indian goods, which are so much better than theirs that they don't have any money left. So they pass a Senate order in emergency to ban Romans from buying from India. Similarly, there's a problem. The shipping routes were blocked because of some wars, and the land routes were blocked, Ottoman Empire, something, and the French king passes an order. Only the royalty can buy Indian goods because there's a great decline in the shippings that's reaching us. Why is this so important? It is to show you that Europe looked towards India, not once, not 1 year, not 10 years, but for centuries throughout. For what? Not merely spices, as your textbooks will say, but for gold, for jewelry, for knowledge, for all kinds of things which Europe could not recreate. India was the world's largest producer of gold jewelry. India was the world's only producer of diamonds until 1895. That tells you something. All of diamonds in the world till 1895 were coming only from India. India was the minor manufacturer of diamonds, polisher, and the jewelry. In 1850, I believe, or around that time, there was a presentation in Paris of Indian jewelry. And the newspapers at that point were full of awe. They said, is it possible for human hands to create such fine jewelry? What did they do? Because it was in the midst of Industrial Revolution, they created machines to replicate the jewelry designs. And therefore, you see, to this day, the jewelry designs in Europe are a replica of Indian jewelry designs. At the same time, you have many of the Europeans coming to India to study and go back to replicate. And there is one Britisher who comes to India, he goes to near Pune, he meets a specialist of Ayurveda, who, by the way, has Ayurveda as his second business. His primary business is as a potter. And he does plastic surgery repairs of the nose. Because one of the forms in which a king would punish an extreme crime was to cut off the nose. And these people would go to the plastic surgeon who would then fix the nose. So it's called a rhinoplasty, a replication of the nose. He sees this amazing system, takes all the tools, learns with him, takes all the tools back to England, replicates it. And in medical history of your European books, it is said, he is the first plastic surgeon of the world. Excuse me. They don't tell you that he learned it from India. In fact, the set of tools he brings for his plastic surgery is an exact replica of the Ayurvedic surgery tools. And to this day, what is used as tools in a surgery room is a replica of the Ayurvedic tools. Interesting. And why is it your history books didn't tell you this? This is all documented. So there's an agenda first, let's recognize. An agenda to hold back India. An agenda to fund even insurgency within India with huge funds coming from all over the world to ensure that our society is in conflict, that we do not recover this underlying sense of unity and love for Mother India. I have seen with my own eyes in an NSS program, National Service Scheme program for young children at the age of 10, I've seen this with my own eyes. The trainer was telling the children, what has your country given you? Why should you love your country if your country hasn't given you enough? What is this? Government-funded programs teaching children to be insidious and to hate their country. And all this was happening 20 years ago. And you have to wonder and ask why. Who is afraid of India's resurgence? Well, let me put it another way. India was so wealthy, and again we come back to some of these statistics, that a single city of Surat was producing enough textiles for internal consumption within India, but for export to Europe. And that single city was producing more textiles than the three biggest companies of Europe put together, of all of Europe put together. And yet the quality of textiles, the print, the variety, the finish, the lasting quality was so much higher that there was no competition. So what did the British do? Well, first they came to trade. Once they found that they could own the production itself, they turned to owning production. They didn't really come to conquer and colonize. They came for trade. But when they could own the producers, well, they made much more money. And bit by bit, that became the basis for a political colonization. But in the process, they shut down industries. And this is documented by the British. They were great documenters. So 1820 to 1830, they shut down all of India's pearl industries. 1830 to 1840, they began the shutdown of all the jewelry industries. 1900 to 1910, they shut down all the shipping industries. India, by the way, had the world's biggest ships and the largest ship production facilities of the world till then. In fact, the ships we produced were so big, they would carry 300 people on a 6-month ocean-going voyage. They lasted for 50 years at a time. European ships, at best, could carry 1/3 the number of people and were about 1/3 the size, and they would last 30 years at most. So when Vasco da Gama celebrated in Europe as the first European to cross the ocean-going voyage, how do you travel in an ocean with winds and currents? How do you know where you are? You need precise navigation skills and mathematics and astronomy. They couldn't do it. So when Vasco da Gama came to India, he was described as the first great navigator. What did actually happen? He was hugging the coast of Africa because they couldn't go beyond the coast. And there he met Kanha, who was a Gujarati trader whose ship was 3 times bigger, and he had 3 ships there. So he tells this trader, I want to go to India. Kana says, follow us. That's how he gets to India on an ocean-going voyage, celebrated in Europe. Well, your history book doesn't tell you this. Shivaji had a massive naval fleet, and there's a battle of 300 ships of Shivaji versus Portuguese off the coast of Maharashtra, which is to this day celebrated in a painting in the naval museums of India, but not in your textbooks. Indian Ocean is the only ocean with the name of a country. Why? Because the entire ocean was ruled by Indian traders. Navi, boating in Sanskrit, is the basis for the word navy in English. And it shows you the origins of naval skills and capacities, not taught. Why is this important? Because it shows you that across the centuries, and I keep repeating this number going back at least 10,000 years, India was the hub of the world's wealth. GDP, according to British records of India, was 30% of global GDP. From the time they took over, it had been reduced to 25% because of the wars with the British. And as they took over, your 25% went down to less than 1%. Because they destroyed your local industries, transferred the industrial production to Europe, made you the raw material producers and the buyers of their products. That's how Europe gained its wealth. To this day, you go to Europe, any of the old cities, all the buildings made from wood are made of teak coming from India or Burma. Why? They come and just cut the forest and took the wood. That's all. That's what was the basis of the wealth. To this day, all over the world, the biggest diaspora of any country is of the Indian diaspora. We have at least 300 centers spread out all over the world where Indians have settled going back at least 3 generations because the British took the Indians to be their indentured labor, slaves, for their facilities, for production of wealth. Every time they had a war in Africa, they put a tax on India, war tax. They had a plague in England, they put a plague tax on India. So it was extracting wealth under any pretentious reason, reducing India to poverty while the wealth there grew. From the point England lost India, she became rapidly one of the poorest. All this is to say something very important. None of this wealth of India was produced by conquering others, like Rome, or like United States of America, or like the British Empire, which all had their wealth produced by conquest of others and enslavement of others. Whereas India conquered nobody, produced its own inherent wealth. Wealth creation is the very nature of the Indian economy or the Indian civilizational value. What was the basis of this was the Vaishya Dharma, or Dharma in every way, in all aspects. Why is this important? Because a civilization that has a sustained standard of the greatest wealth, the greatest knowledge, the greatest strength and organizational skills for going back 10,000 years, even if it loses it for 200 years because of colonization, cannot remain lost for long. The momentum of 10,000 years is still there. But what is preventing it from emerging rapidly is the borrowed Europeanized system which is imposed on us, which doesn't work. So every time you try to do something, you hit another barrier. You avoid it, you hit another barrier, which is the primary reason for corruption, by the way. The Indian people learned that under this extreme burden of systems and rules and regulations of the British colonization, the only way was bypass those rules. And you developed a skill to bypass and work around systems rather than following systems, rebelling against systems. And of course, it worked very effectively. As you know, one of the methods of transaction we have what is called Hawala transaction. Was a great strength of India. The current governments have tried to suppress Hawala because they can't account for it, they can't tax you for it. But the whole Hawala system was based on trust. I transfer money here and over there in another city, the money is transferred to my family. Who holds the accounting? The people involved are trusted. Isn't that something extraordinary? The whole operation of wealth processing and wealth production was built on trust. You gave your word, it was not broken. A promise was never broken. So there are visitors from across, from China, from Europe, going back about, let's say, 1,000 years, from Saudi Arabia, from the Arabian region. Visitors coming here, describing this. The Indian people are so wealthy. And this is, let's say, one of the descriptions about 500 years ago from a Britisher says that the common villager, a farmer, is more wealthy than the wealthy people of Europe because of the facilities they have, because of the jewelry they wear. Obviously seen. A single city of, at the time, Agra, was more wealthy than London. In fact, in the last great battle which took place, the British, when they finally conquered the emperor, they found the royal treasury, and then they found 2 gigantic underground chambers which had been hidden, full of gold and jewelry. What did they do? Well, they just won, so they transfer it to a ship. And the ship leaves for India. But there's more, so they transfer to another ship, which leaves for India. There's more, they transfer to a 3rd ship, 4th ship, 5th ship. Okay, I'll jump forward. 10 ships, 20 ships, 30 ships. Okay, let me speed it up. 50 ships, 80 ships, 118 ships, and they ran out of ships. That's the kind of wealth one treasury of the emperor had. And we had 300 princely states. Do you remember about 5 or 10 years ago, there was a famous temple in Kerala in which there were 3 underground chambers. By order of court, one of the chambers was opened. It had enough gold to wipe out the entire national debt. And it had been kept secret. It was owned by the king, or rather the king was giving money to the deity. One example. And all the major temples of India used to be like this. That's why the invaders used to go straight for the temple. Yes, okay, they took great pleasure in destroying idols, but that was not a goal in itself. It was also the wealth that they took away, as in Somnath. And this is to tell you the wealth creation capability of a civilization. No conquest of anybody else, no subjugation of any slave and of anyone in slavery. You want a model for the world's future economic development? Here it is. Except we seem to have lost it. Or at least we don't know anymore what was the basis for it, right? Well, it's still valid, it's still working at the village levels, but largely broken up. But the point is, it's inherent in the civilizational, cultural strength. If India is unshackled, this power will surge forward, not only in economic development, in sciences, in knowledge. Look at what happened with Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is zero without the Indians sitting there. But these were the same Indians who were suppressed, oppressed by all kinds of government regulations and reservations. They said, enough of this, we go and do what we can elsewhere. They gathered in Silicon Valley, that became the hub of the world's creative genius of IT, run by the Indians. But of course, they were managed by the Americans because we lost the management power. I remember 1994 it was, Bill Gates came to India and he announced, Indians make the best, most intelligent programmers and they're the best team workers. And so I've come here to take the 50 best programmers from India. 1994, it was just the beginning of the IT revolution of Silicon Valley. But this observation was interesting, that they work best as a team. They were not very good as leaders, but they were good as followers. And that's a remnant of the colonization phase. But all this is to show you that the genius inherent is still there, and whatever suppression has no meaning. If you unshackle rapidly, there will be an explosion of Indian creativity. The other systems and powers fear this and do everything they can to subjugate India or hold it in division by internal conflict. Now, this is just for our understanding, but also to recognize that the power cannot be held back. But in this awakening, what we do will make all the difference, whether it will happen rapidly through a joyous awakening or slowly through much suffering. That's our choice. And that's why these principles, these ideas need to be brought back into the educational system. And it will not be by adding one more subject of morality and ethics. You know, one of the problems we have in the European model of education, you slot things in. So we find, okay, we have a problem of corruption. Well, let's throw in one more subject. What do you do with that? Teach values. How do you teach values? You must be good, you must not tell lies, you must cooperate because it's good for you. We have environmental destruction. Okay, let's throw in another subject for environmental science. What do they tell you? Trees are good for you, therefore you should plant more trees. Don't cut trees because they give you oxygen, it's good for you. You see what you're doing? Do you see the perversion in the teaching? You plant trees because they are good for you, because they give you oxygen. If they didn't give you oxygen, you could kill them. It doesn't matter. That's what you're teaching. You see, it's not what you tell the children, it's what is implied. There is an explicit curriculum and there is an implicit curriculum. The implied curriculum is you do because it's good for you. What was our traditional teaching? Trees are your brothers and sisters. I remember at one time in the evening, I was about to pull a leaf and my mother said, "Stop, the tree is sleeping. You don't wake it like this." Has your grandmother or mother told you this? Have you told this to your children? Okay, I don't see too many yeses, but a few yes. Did they accept?
Yes, in the younger years.
Okay, in the younger years, exactly. In the older years, they don't. It doesn't make sense because they've been hardened. They've been disconnected from that innate sense of connection which we are born with. And once they've been sufficiently disconnected, you can tell it and it doesn't make sense. But if you catch them young enough, they feel it, but even then the disconnection may take place later. What is it in the system that is causing the disconnection? Can we correct for it? Now, these are all deeper questions we won't go into, but all of this is to show you, coming back to the big picture, the role India has played in the world's affairs going back 10,000 years has not ended. It still continues. Not only it has seeded knowledge to Europe through the philosophies, through the mathematics. The whole of European enlightenment was driven by contact with India. The whole of the philosophies emergent were based on the Indian Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. And even the modern developments in science, as you know, the scientists of quantum physics were all students of Sanskrit. And as you know, they quoted from the Bhagavad Gita when Oppenheimer saw the atomic explosion. Why is this important? Because it is these ideas which have seeded the awakening in Europe. In fact, I'll touch one more point on this. For 500 years in Europe, there was a great battle between the church and those who were studying or teaching mathematics. The church had a Roman numeral system, which makes it impossible to do complex maths. And the mathematicians from Italy who knew the Indian numbering system, they kept insisting we have to teach the Hindu numbering system. Why? Because maths becomes easy. And the opposition of the church was to say, if maths becomes easy, how will we control people? Right now they have to come to us for the maths calculations. We cannot decentralize mathematics. And eventually, after 500 years of struggle, the mathematicians won, and with the sharp reaction where they threw out the church, basically, from life and politics. That's what they call secularism, by the way. Was when the Indian mathematics, the Hindu numbering system was brought back, and there was a burst of mathematics. And following that burst of physics, chemistry, and all the other sciences burst out in a reaction against the church. That's why there's such a strong hatred for the church in large parts of Europe even today, because it held back development. And here we have the same tendencies increasing. When the Pope came to Asia the first time he came to India, he announced that the first millennium we conquered Europe, second millennium we conquered Americas, and this millennium we want to conquer India. For what? And the same kind of mind grip being imposed. It's nothing to do with the teaching of Christ. It is the control of church, which is a very different thing. So we have to recognize that there are tendencies which want to keep India held back. And inevitably in the past, India has played a huge role in the awakening of knowledge and continues today through Silicon Valley or other such facilities. But in India, we have not yet seen such a bursting because the systems are still warped. When will this change? I mentioned briefly this morning that we've got our political freedom. We have not yet got the economic freedom. We're still part of that same warped system. We have not yet got the intellectual freedom. We are still busy quoting X, Y, Z, however great they are, including quoting from Upanishads, means nothing. It means you've only learned by heart and repeated what you mugged up. To think for yourself. And having thought, if you come back to the same conclusion, then that has value and you won't need to quote at that point. Because you'll be able to evidence it, you'll be able to prove what you have come to. The power of independent thinking has been dulled through the period of colonizations. This needs to be regenerated. And Sri Aurobindo points out the land which worshipped Shakti has gone into inertia because it forgot the worship of Shakti. That has to reawaken. The Shakti can start, even if you like, on your personal ego Shakti. Within me is the power to do. Great, start with that. And then you will discover your power comes from the greater universal power, which is itself a divine power. But doesn't matter, start with what is there. So we need to undergo a huge revolution. And that revolution is not going to be a European import. It will be a rebuilding from within. And those of you who are already in education or in industry or in any other field, including farming, go back to your roots, rebuild from scratch. Find new ways. Thankfully, today we have the means through the internet and other to bypass all imposed institutional structures and create grassroots, peer-based networking systems, which allow us somehow to work outside the system and rapidly make changes. In fact, India is one of the most adaptive countries. If you recall how quickly India took in computers, mobile phones, while other countries were still struggling, shows you that agility of mind is still there, but it has not yet been unleashed to follow its own creativity. Think for yourself. Get others to think for themselves. There's no right answer. There's only the power of thought for you to find an answer or many answers. I had recently a meeting with one of the major religious groups within India, and they were trying to regenerate Indian values in their schools. There are more than 300 schools. And they said, we have got this fantastic plan. We are going to teach children to create their own video films. I said, great. And the brilliance of the idea was, we will have such and such film actor who will come and judge and give the best film award. I said, what a disaster. So I had a whole conflict with them, and they refused to cave in until I quoted from the Bhagavad Gita. Then the guy said, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then the plan was changed. What did I say? I said that the moment you do that, what are you teaching the children? Film actor is your ideal. He's the great man. He will judge you to be great. What do? You start shaping yourself to his values. The poor fellow is a third-rate drunkard of the lowest cultural values. He just happens to be a famous film actor because he puts up a pretense he is funded by somebody. That's all there is to it. And you make him an ideal. What do you think children will grow to be? Because they want to imitate that which you have placed as the ideal, and then don't complain if they don't go in deeper values. So I said, throw out all these. What do? You get the children to judge themselves. Again, the idea that one person will be first and 99% will then suffer, I didn't get any prize. Who has benefited? The one person gets an exaggerated ego. When he meets life, he fails. Because coming first has not prepared you for life. The 99 have lost their sense of self-worth. And when they meet life, they go always with a sense that I'm not good enough. So I said, you will create at least 10 different categories for judging. One will be best script, best editing, best visuals, best sound, best acting. Create categories. Let the children judge each other's based on categories and have multiple awards on each category. The result will be suddenly you'll have 30 or 40 awards given. What happens? Each one is appreciated for their uniqueness. And when he was resisting, when I quoted in the Bhagavad Gita, where Sri Krishna says, it is better to fail following your own dharma than to succeed following someone else's. So please don't try to be like your film actor and be first for some warped value. That got him the message. But you see how deeply, with all the good intentions, we still fall back into the warped values. The commonest problem, since some of your parents and grandparents, is we drive children to come first instead of enjoying the growth of their skills, capacities, and receiving love from parents. In fact, we've taught them to fear because you'll be pressured, you'll be criticized if you don't come first, and there's the gigantic scramble to come first on a warped value. Forget it. I tell the children, I don't care if you come first. Can you do your best in developing your creativity? And highlight this. And in any field that you like. And incidentally, if you get a few awards, great, but it has no value for me. And it is very dangerous for schools if you say that. They stop inviting you. When I do tell the children in the school, exams don't matter in life. Because finally, when you live life, it will be your capacity to work as a team, to lead, or to be creative, or to be truthful. Those are the things which will be valued. And all the management of the school becomes extremely nervous. They come back and say, yes, but you must do well in exams. Okay. Okay, so all of this is to bring back this bigger picture. The role India has played and the role India is inevitably going to play. We are in the transition. What we do will decide how this transition takes place. First, start by educating yourself. There's a special feature of the Indian mind, and I will end with this idea. Sri Aurobindo points out the mold of the Indian mind is fundamentally different from the mold of the European mind. The European mind, and that includes now a large part of the West, is trained to look from outside in, to cut up pieces and to analyze, and to reduce things to objectivized and measurable values. The Indian mind inherently has a sense of infinity, has a sense of a continuum of reality, has a sense of inside-out perception which is primarily intuitive, not analytic but synthetic. Now they're almost opposite in values. We have been trained now under the colonized influence for those values, and perhaps there's a deeper evolutionary purpose for it. But we should now take the best of those values and recover our inherent values. Now, we had a beautiful presentation about Sanskrit earlier, and I was tempted to say something about this. And I will give this as one example of how a language reflects this, but it's part of this discussion. You see, a language always reflects your thought, your mind structure, your civilizational values. So you go to Eskimo language, we are told 50 different names for snow. Because snow is their primary reality, and the fine distinctions between snow define their survival. So what is India's value system that you find in the Indic languages and of course in Sanskrit? Something fascinating. So if you take a European dictionary, French to Spanish, let's say, for a given word in French, there's a word in Spanish. For a given word in Spanish, there's a word in French. Very simple. Now you take an English Sanskrit dictionary. For a given word in English, there are 20 different words in Sanskrit. For a given word in Sanskrit, there are 20 different words in English. Something is wrong, right? It's not a one-to-one equivalence. What is this mess? In fact, you look at a Sanskrit dictionary, it is huge. Just a Sanskrit dictionary, not just English Sanskrit. Huge. And in that, the shorter the word, the longer the description. A single letter K goes to 2 pages. And the longer the word, the shorter the explanation. Strange, isn't it? I'll explain to you the secret of this. And this goes to the heart of what we are discussing about the Indian mind. You see, when you speak in English, the way the mind works, you start with a blank slate. I'm throwing words one by one. I am going, and it could branch out in many different ways. Home, I've taken one branch. I am going home. And now the idea is complete, right? In Sanskrit, you're not filling an emptiness. You're starting with the all, Brahman, everything is there before you. So when you speak one letter, you have narrowed down the everything to one aspect. You bring another letter and there's a narrowing. You bring a third letter, it becomes narrow. And a fourth letter completes an idea. The word meaning. That's why the longer the word, the more narrow the idea. The shorter the word, the more wide and inclusive the idea. Interesting. Because it is not a language of the intellect with idea relating to words. It is a language of intuition, where there's an impulse emerging which is intuitive, which can burst out into many different concepts, each of which can burst into many different ideas, each of which can burst into many word forms, thought forms. A language which is inherently intuitive, therefore, works completely differently. How is your mind formed? In 1945, Sri Aurobindo is talking to a group of disciples in the evening talks, Nirod Baran and others, okay? So these are people who studied in England for a few years and then came back to India. Some of them didn't study in England, but in English schools. And Sri Aurobindo tells them, your minds are already half Europeanized. You don't know what it's like to have the Indian mind. What happens to the rest of us today? Why is this important? Because the phase of colonization served many purposes for India's development. There's a whole interesting text of Sri Aurobindo where he justifies why British colonization was good for India or necessary for India. The problem was it stayed too long, and so it created inertia. It suppressed too much. But what it brought initially was exactly the thing which India needed, which India had lost through that phase of ascetic withdrawal. And the correction needed was brought by this colonization impulse. But what has happened to the training of our mind is momentarily it has gone through that, momentarily I mean in civilizational terms, 50 years, 100 years, it's gone through that mindset and now must come back to the Indic way of thinking, inside out, intuitivized. And this is part of the challenge for us today. And one of the ways for this you will find happening when you read Sri Aurobindo. His writing is inherently an inside-out, intuitive to mind, but bridging the two perfectly. And when you read that initially, you will find, oh, this is difficult, but persist. And suddenly, after a few weeks, something clicks and everything begins to make sense, but in an inside-out way. And it actually lifts your mind and begins to intuitivize it. It's the most effective means I've found. But there are other methods, there are practices you can do to develop intuition. But all this is to tell you that there is an inherent nature of the Indian mind. If you have grown up in a vernacular school, and this is critical, you already have something of that influence. If you have grown up in a Europeanized school, then you have grown up with that value mold. And this is very important. This difference is important. In India, we have two conflicting viewpoints today. There are those who grew up in the European mindset from the beginning, who think in that outside-in way. And then there are those, and it doesn't matter if you speak English. If your initial training was inside-out, you have a collision of these two. And you have to understand now why this is happening. It's a mindset issue. But this is not lost. It's covered up only. It can be brought forward once again. And those who have gone through that other training and then come back to the intuitivized mind have the most rich and flexible power of the intellect. So if you think in long term, if you think of this deeper perspective, you do not lose hope. Rather, you see a greater potential for a richer emergence of the civilization. So I would have liked to give you more examples of this, but I think you get the point, and with the limited time we have, I will pause here. And we'll conclude with this idea that India is destined to play a significant role in world affairs, but her spiritual awakening is a necessary foundation because it is that which she has to also share with the world. And we can take up any questions for 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Yes.
What you bring up the Bible spirit to an extent, sorry. Okay. Whatever you described about India being suppressed, can we see it as a catalyst for us to emerge? So that was one. And the second part is, what does one do about media? Because it feels like media is a bigger guru these days than even parents. So I just wanted to comment this. Second question, because it's very rampant, we're seeing very
Your first question about whether to take the suppression in a positive way, you can always look for a positive outcome from any negative thing. But certainly it would have been better if India had not been suppressed and the inertia had not settled. And the mother commented on this extensively. She was enormously disappointed by the lack of thought, lack of effort to think among the children. And then she described this fascinating experience. She said, I tried to find the source for this mental inertia. And so she went down into the consciousness of the mindset of the children, and she describes how it was full of this sharp edges going deep into darkness, and at the very bottom of what was the most deep and dark inertia, she touched a spring which threw her into this whole new world and a rich new possibility for the future. So yes, we can take it in that spirit that behind this and through it something greater will come. But still one wishes it did not happen in this way. But coming to the media, in a large part, this was a necessary, inevitable transition in evolution. What we could not transmit to them, nature is providing now in a larger way, in a universalized awakening. You see, nature is pushing the young mind today to universalize first rather than specialize. And you see, the impulse of the young people is as if to know a little bit of everything, however shallow. Later, perhaps the deepening will take place. But recognize what nature is trying to do. And so you cannot prevent them from knowing a little bit about everything. But right at the beginning, if you can awaken in them this deeper discrimination and sensitivity, this feels right, this feels comfortable, that feels uncomfortable because it's crude, it's gross, it's perverse. That distinction, that sensitivity, we have to gift as early as possible. If you have not done that, they can as easily be sucked into the perversion as into the good. And if we have not done that, it's our fault, not their fault. The media, unfortunately, is more full of negative things than positive. Cinema today has become so dark in the last 10 years that even the heroic cinema has got a perversion everywhere. And that's intentional. There's a whole agenda behind that to subjugate and pervert the young. But you have to fight it. We have to, if possible, create positive cinema. But in the absence of that, none of us here are filmmakers. But in the absence of that, open the children to the positive things with the Mahabharata serials, the new ones which have come, the old ones which are there. They're deeply moving and inspiring and leave a deep imprint which shapes you from inside out. As early as possible, narrate the stories before you show videos, because narration gets the child's mind to form the images, which is better for training the mind's powers than if you show a visual, which is hypnotic, but suppresses your own imaginative powers. But we have to correct it from our side first.
How should the school education should be?
School education.
Commercial, non-commercial.
The school education needs to be rebuilt. The whole pedagogy, the method of teaching has to be rebuilt as I described earlier. It cannot be rote learning, it cannot be exam-based, it has to be project-based, creativity-based.
Skill-based?
Skill-based, yes, certainly, but what skills? You see, what happens in our thinking of life skills, we reduce everything. Abacus has no value, we have calculators. No, I'm sorry, abacus has immense value because it is developing faculties of the mind. So physical skill and job skills are not important because by the time you complete your school education, all those jobs will be gone, replaced by robots. I recently had a lecture at a management institute, and there they had on the panel very big industrialists and top performers of the institute were there to receive awards. And I said to them, you have these big names here so that you might be inspired by them to become like them, but don't make the mistake of imitating them. They were great because they followed their own deepest impulse of creativity. You should not be like them. You should follow the deepest impulse of creativity. That is your example. But I said, everything you've learned in your training in the last few years is entirely useless for the future. Why? Very logically. Because whatever could be trained into you can be trained into artificial intelligence, which will replace you. Your worth for the future is in the things which can't be trained. And your creativity, you see. So when you enter a world where all training can be reduced to AI, you have no place for mechanical training. It's the other aspect which will be important, and that's what made them successful, that's what will make you successful. And yet the training was necessary because it has given you a base of application, but it's not enough. This is what you see.
That's what is pulling us.
You know, that's my point. If you reduce it to one blueprint, you will repeat. Whereas the blueprint itself is to creating creativity. Yes, there is a blueprint, but not for replacing this book by that book. It's how you read the book which is important, and that will be through a creative process. And yes, they have training programs. Yes.
For a resurgent India, unfortunately, India has major casting communities. Now, when we talk of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, we are only talking of Hindus, right? Like, you want to recognize all Hindus as a family, but if other caste and communities don't want to recognize each other as a part of the family,
Yes.
how are you going to make really a powerful
A
India?
very important point here is this is a very loosely quoted Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is part of a larger statement which says that a mind which thinks only of I is narrow and suffocating, but a mind which is wide, for that mind the whole world is family. It's a big statement. So recognize there are two kinds of minds, the narrow ones and the wide ones. And if a wide one meets a narrow one, you cannot treat the narrow one as if it is wide. It is out there to harm you, to seize from you. You have to treat it the way it deserves. That is the adhikara bheda, the distinction of competence. So you do not throw your wealth at somebody who will squander it. Rather, you will help him to outgrow his squandering nature or his narrowness or whatever. But you have to withhold. You cannot treat as equal just everybody because somebody quoted something from a text, right? There was a question at the back. Somebody I don't know, someone had raised their hands. Okay. There was one question from, do we have time, a minute? Somebody said, I had asked a question and I asked them to repeat the question later. It's yours? Yeah, okay.
So I was asking about the universal mother, the divine mother of the divine. I mean, everybody in the world has her children. That is what universal mother is all about. In that case, how is it that a group of children want to kill another group of children, and it is sanctioned in their religion to do that?
Yes.
How can that be a part of the same universal mother?
So certainly not all religions are equal. That's another false statement. All religions are the same. No, they're not. They have different objectives, different priorities. They represent different values. Certainly all can be valid ways to the divine. But it doesn't mean all ways to the divine are the same. Okay, so we have to understand there are differences, and there are religious forms in which there is a large component which is of the local culture and of an age which is, let's say, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, which have no relevance to the present or the future. So we have to sift the component of religion which represents eternal values and components which represent past or even obsolete values. And if a religion has gone through an internal introspection, they will normally do that sifting and regenerate themselves, as Christianity has done to a great extent within Europe in the Reformation. But it still needs to go through many other reformations, which you see is the struggle currently. As should every tradition, including the Indian traditions within the larger Hindu or Sanatana Dharma movement. There are many subcultures which need to go through their own regeneration. But all this is part of the impulse of nature to bring these different values in collision so that each can begin to introspect, discover in the other the element lacking in them and internalize it. At the same time, let go of its own rigidities to have a broader perspective. But if there is a destructive impulse in one, well, you have to know to contain it rather than expose yourself to it. So these are practical problems, and they do not just, they don't make you doubt the validity that there is one divine consciousness that supports all. It supports equally stupidity because that's our starting point. But it pushes from inside the stupidity to outgrow our stupidities. And every religion equally must outgrow its limitations.
You spoke about how the education system is more like an industry. And you also said how free thinking has to be encouraged, right? So how do you make that independence of the whole industrial way of looking at education and encourage?
Simply ask yourself why a school is created. If the objective of school is to have high performers, for which you will then charge more money, then you can see what will happen in the values of the school training. In fact, let me tell you something very interesting. All high-performing schools do not perform high because of their inherent training. They perform high because they have an entrance exam by which they take in high performers. It's called input-output. You get an input of high performance, you'll get output of high performance. Let me put it another way. The children who got into IIT because of the very difficult entrance exam, whether they pass through IIT or not, will perform well wherever they go because they've already proved a certain capacity. You see the point? So IIT in itself, at best, is a ground where if they have creativity, it can grow. But if the goal of the institution was to charge more because we have high pass percentage, that's industry. That's not teaching. I'm sorry. So the first correction is, what are you adding in the school period? What are you adding in the school period that helps child grow from what they were to something greater? Did you even do that? Most schools don't. At least the high-performing ones. In fact, the schools which don't have high performance as their goal are the ones who do this more. Necessarily, therefore, they can't charge more. So the whole thing is kind of a vicious cycle. And it can only change if there's a fundamental shift in how we evaluate and how industry chooses people. But anyway, it's part of a larger discussion. I'm sorry. There's one point though in the question why I'd asked you to repeat the question, because he had said something like, if all this is formed by the divine play, why is there this situation of conflict? After all, as the question went, the divine makes us do this, the divine makes them do that, right? That was the way he had worded the question. And I said, it's very important to correct this idea, because this is not true. The divine does not make you do this. The divine consciousness is essentially the one same in all things, but in the essence, not in the form. The form that has evolved to be able to create an independent individual center of action, which includes the freedom to go against the divine will if it so chooses. Otherwise, it won't be a free center. And the parts of humanity which exercise the freedom to go against the divine will are the ones which are the cause of these problems. The ones which go against dharma. But again, dharma is not as in the textbooks of many religions, God said this, so you should follow this. Dharma is an inherent truth of your being by which you fulfill what you are, not someone saying something to you or even a holy book. So in the dharma is your greatest freedom to be yourself. And yet when you follow your innate dharma, your freedom does not collide with somebody else's freedom. But to go against your dharma is what creates the warping and therefore the collisions. But the idea that the divine makes you do is wrong. The divine helps you to grow into independent freedom. And you have the freedom. And you have to exercise the freedom. And again, a corrective I will bring because it's important for our understanding. Because you see a lot of loose talk in the spiritual space where they say, all this is karma. Because of karma you're suffering. Because of karma you're bound. No, that's not the Vedic vision. That is the Buddhist vision. Because in Buddhism, they took out God, they took out soul. What's left is machinery of nature. In the Vedic vision, the prime driver is the freedom of the soul and the self, not only from within, but from above. And therefore, prime driver of your whole evolution is your free choice. Karma is incidental within that, because whatever you begin has a ripple effect. And your past actions are still affecting you, but your future actions will change your future. You define your future by your free actions today. So you have to review and understand karma not as a binding power, but as the power of creating your future. It's a liberating power. And if you then rest on the freedom of the soul and the divine consciousness, karma is secondary. The freedom of the soul can act to turn a negative karma into positive outcome or completely dissolve a karma because self is free and not bound by karma. And this is the deeper perspective even in the integral yoga. So always assert the freedom of choice that you have, not only in your intelligence as freedom, but the deeper freedom of the soul within you by reference to it, and exercise that freedom. And it is in this way that by the awakening of dharma in our hearts, there will be the civilizational awakening of dharma in India and overflowing into the world. Namaste.